Hello and welcome back to Long COVID MD. I'm your host, Dr. Zeest Khan, a physician navigating recovery from long COVID. We have an exciting interview today, and our guest is David Tuller, a journalist with a strong background in public health. He actually has a graduate level degree. He is the perfect journalist to help us assess and understand scientific studies that are coming out about long COVID because he's been doing this for quite some time. Since 2015, David has been covering the PACE trial, which, as we explain in the interview, was a large research study based in the United Kingdom that focused on the benefits of using physical therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy on patients with chronic fatigue syndrome or myalgic encephalomyelitis. The study's methods were deeply flawed, and the guidelines that were heavily influenced by the study have now been changed in big part because of David's deep digging into and criticism of the methods that were used here. We're going to get into that. But it affects us today because, as David will tell you, many of the same flawed methodologies and assumptions that were applied to patients with chronic fatigue syndrome are now being applied to those of us with long COVID. I want to tell you a little bit more formally about our guest. David Tuller has a doctorate in public health from UC Berkeley. He is a senior fellow in public health and journalism at UC Berkeley's Center for Global Public Health. He was a reporter and editor for 10 years at the San Francisco Chronicle and served as health editor at Salon. He's also written articles about public health and medical issues for the New York Times and for the policy journal Health Affairs. Since 2015, he's been investigating scientific, methodological, and ethical problems with research on myalgic encephalomyelitis or chronic fatigue syndrome. His ongoing series on this issue is called Trial by Error, and it can be found on Virology blog. Virology blog is the science site hosted by Vincent Raccaniello, a microbiology professor at Columbia University. And the entire series can be found at virology.ws/MECFS. The link to Virology blog and ways you can support David Tuller's work will be listed in the show notes below. I hope you enjoy this interview. He is a very passionate journalist and has a wealth of information. And as you listen to him, as you learn from him, if you do appreciate what you hear, consider contributing and supporting him. We'll leave links to his crowdfunding below here. And at the end, we'll explain how his position at UC Berkeley is funded. So without further ado, let's get started. Absolutely. Well, David Tuller, thank you for joining me here on Long COVID MD. I'm really excited to talk to you about medical journalism and medical research surrounding MECFS, our cousin of long COVID, and now long COVID. I've been really interested in understanding how to absorb medical literature, medical journalism, and I know my listeners have been too. I have a bit of a medical background, but it doesn't save me from being confused by articles that are published about long COVID. You have a very unique background in that you are an experienced and trained journalist, and you also have an advanced degree in public health.
Mm-hmm.
What led you to, well, which came first and what led you to the other?
Well, first, I'm not a trained journalist because back when in the day, we didn't go to at least in the U.S. Yeah, we didn't. I didn't get journalism training. I just started working when I was in my 20s, and so basically, I was a journalist. I'm 67, so this is going back to the 80s. I worked as a journalist, and then I moved to San Francisco in 1988, and as a newspaper reporter, I got a job as a newspaper reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle when we still had viable, you know, growing newspapers. And so then I was there for about 10 or 12 years, 10 years, and I was doing other stuff. And but I covered, I was interested in health issues. And so I covered, at that time, I covered HIV a lot in San Francisco. I'm a gay guy, so that was of interest to me. And so I covered health issues, and we had a lot of insurance debates in the US at that time about health insurance. So I covered all of that. So I was interested in health. And then after I left the Chronicle in the early 2000s, I went to University of California at Berkeley campus, which is across the bay from San Francisco, and I got a master's and then I got a doctorate in public health. Now I don't have a PhD. If people write, they say he's a PhD. No, I don't have a PhD. I have a DRPH, which is a Doctor of Public Health, which is a professional doctorate as opposed to an academic doctorate. It's kind of a Anyway, it's a doctorate, but it's a somewhat different kind of doctorate. But so I have a doctorate in public health. It's interdisciplinary, I guess, as opposed to like a PhD in epidemiology. So I basically, and so basically, as part of that, you study epidemiology, and so that just gave me a way. I've never became a full-fledged public health person because by the time I graduated from public health, I got my doctorate. I was 56 already. So I basically have been, more in depth. Uh, Look, investigations are looking into some medical research, and that's happened to become in this field. Um, I got into this specifically because, well, not sort of half accidentally. I'm not a patient, so people sometimes wonder or ask me like, why why are you doing this? And I had a friend who got sick with what was then in the early 90s, and he was diagnosed with what was then being called CFIDS, chronic fatigue immune dysfunction syndrome, I think it was, and was one of the names, trying to get away from the CFS name that everybody hated.
Hmm.
And so that was in the early 90s, and so I sort of tracked his disease progression or his illness as it continued. And then when there was about in 2009, there was a study published in Science magazine that purported to show a link between retrovirus called XMRV and then called chronic fatigue syndrome. And this got a lot of big publicity. And so it became a huge controversy. And so at that time, I was doing a lot of work for the New York Times for the health section. I was also studying at Berkeley. And so I was writing a lot about that particular study and the debate about that study and subsequent follow-up studies that seemed to show that it wasn't the case. And it turned out to be a lab contamination. And so that whole thing ended. But in the middle of that, the PACE trial came out. And I wrote a story about the PACE trial. And I don't know if we need to explain for your listeners what the PACE trial is, but this was a
Yeah.
huge study in 2011 that was done by British folks, um, psychiatrists, mental health people, other clinicians, purporting to show that exercise therapy or graded exercise therapy and cognitive behavior therapy could lead to improvements were beneficial for patients with then called chronic fatigue syndrome, now being called MECFS mostly, even though we don't quite know what it is. And this is usually probably a cluster of different things all together that not differentiated perhaps. So that study came out, and it turned out to be quite, I would say, in my mind, fraudulent because it was really deceptively written. And, we don't need to go into the whole thing, but it basically is an awful study, but purported to prove that these therapies were effective. And so that then I wrote a not good story about that because I hadn't seen it before. I wrote that for the New York Times, and I got pushback from patients saying, no, what are you doing? It's a terrible study. And then I looked into it more, and sort of that became the core of how I became what I am now, which is someone who's been writing about this for 10 years, which was not something I sat down to do 15 years ago. I didn't say, oh, I'm going to be the chronic fatigue syndrome reporter. That's not that wouldn't be an aspiration someone would have had 15 years ago. But it's turned out to be an
Sure.
amazing
But
project, and I'm very glad I sort of stumbled onto it, because it's really been a very incredible project to have been able to work on and do. So I feel very glad.
well,
I couldn't have foreseen
it
that.
is remarkable. Yeah, and it is remarkable to spend enough time in a field that you understand the players in the game, the context, and that itself is something that a new member in this community isn't going to readily have access to. And that's why I think your voice in the field is so important. And I want to, for people who aren't as familiar, the PACE study, as you said, was done in the UK. It suggested that graded exercise therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy were valid treatments for MECFS. And it influenced the NIH's approach to treating patients with MECFS. Is that right?
And the CDCs and everybody around the world. I mean, it was
Oh,
really highly.
really?
Yes, yes. I mean, the CDC cited it in all of its pages, and the CDC finally disappeared it in like 2017 or 2017. They kind of disappeared most references to it. There may still some be, somewhere stuck in some page, but basically they got rid of it. They got rid of the advice after, a couple of years into this whole. After the Institute of in 2015, the Institute of Medicine in the U.S., now called the National Academy of Medicine, issued a big report which basically made it clear, refuted PACE without, directly
Without
refuting,
saying as much.
without saying as much, and that really became the basis for the CDC ultimately to have to change its pages. But they were also pressured a lot by patients and by me. They
So tell us what you found with the PACE study. Like, what were the big
what was
methodological
oh,
issues?
oh my, okay. Um, so, well, the first issue with all of these studies, PACE, its predecessor studies, and the studies that we see of CBT and GET, or these things in long COVID, are that they are, by nature, by definition, they're unblinded, because it's hard to blind what a therapy is, right? You can't really blind graded exercise therapy and pretend it's not graded exercise therapy, because that's what it is. It's not like a pill where you have a really a placebo that hopefully looks exactly like the pill, so nobody knows. So you combine that, and then they rely completely on subjective outcomes, and the subjective outcomes are essentially, how do you feel? Now they're a little more specific, how much, what's your physical function, how fatigued are you? There's different questions that set that up, but essentially, if you look at it in a large scale, they're all basically saying, how do you feel? So if you give one group of people a therapy and you tell them for 6 months or 3 months, this therapy is going to make you feel better or could make you feel better, and then you give people either nothing, or they're on a waiting list, which is often the condition, or they're not getting anything. They're getting treatment as usual, or standard care, which is essentially you see your doctor. And the other ones are getting that too. They're just getting added therapies on top of it, or they may be getting a therapy that, if it's really a controlled study, they're controlling for the time with the therapy by giving them, hand holding. You're hand holding with the therapist watching a movie, but you're not
Mm.
getting active therapy, but you're getting the time and devotion that a therapist would spend the same amount to sort of balance off the time there. That's often not done. But in any event, even if it is, you're trying to balance out the active part of the therapy. So in any event, if one person is getting something that they're told or they expect will make them feel better and others are not, it's human nature that at the end, if you're asked, hey, how do you feel? You're going to more likely, somewhat, and remember, the results in these studies are never huge. They're a bit, they don't have people
Mhm.
generally. So you're going to have people saying they're better. So it doesn't mean very much. And so what happens in a lot of these studies, and so what happened in PACE is that they set up these therapies, and they wrote a protocol. And like you do, you write a protocol beforehand in order to get funding and approvals, ethical permissions and all that. You write a proposal, and you say, this is what we're going to do, and this is what our outcomes are, and this is what, how we're going to measure it. And then that's what you publish. Seems pretty simple. Now, there's always changes, things happen, you get permissions from your committees to make changes, and you can do this and that, and you can publish other things. But you're not supposed to just completely change all your outcome measures in a way that makes them weaker, or the major outcome measures in a way that makes them all weaker so that you're more likely to get results. That's exactly what happened in the PACE trial. For some of the changes, they got approval from their committees, but the changes were absurd. The changes were absurd and not possible. And so the thing that's kept me interested in the fraudulence of this trial for the 10 years now I've been looking at it is how a trial with these kinds of errors, these kinds of problems, which I'll explain the main one that I see that make them just ridiculous on its face. How did that become so accepted as this great trial that set policy around the world, not just in the UK? And the main thing that they did was there are two major outcomes. There are two major criteria to enter the trial, and as there were also their major outcomes were two scales for fatigue and for um, physical function. And these were questionnaires, or instruments as they're called. So these were questionnaires with a number of questions about your fatigue levels and your physical function. And so let's talking about physical function. This is a highly often used scale. It's called the SF-36, and it's the SF-36 short form physical function scale. So they on that measure, basically, most people, even people with some handicap, limitations, would score pretty high. So basically, people with normal function would be scoring 90, 95, up there in the high 80s, 90s. So in the original protocol for the PACE trial, they had this scale. In order to be disabled on the scale, you had to be 60 was considered disabled, 60 or below. They changed that partway into the trial because they weren't getting enough recruits, so they made that slightly easier. So you had to get 65 or below on this questionnaire in order to be disabled enough on physical function specifically to enter the PACE trial. So I'm sorry to be very belabored, and it's very complicated, which is why it's hard for patients to understand, and it took me a year looking into it to try to actually explain it, and why I had to write a 15,000 word piece about it because it's all very complicated. And on the face, if you just look at the paper and don't deeply look into it and look at the protocol and see what actually happened versus you're not going to notice it. Or you're likely not going to notice it. And so it's very complicated. So they took this. So for physical function, you had to score 65 or below to get into the trial as disabled for physical function. When they started the PACE trial in the protocol, they had two different levels. You would be improved for physical function if you scored 10 points higher, 75 or below, like 75 or above. So 70, if you started 65 and then you got to 75, that was considered improved for physical function. If you got to 85, that was considered recovered for physical function. Okay, well, that's somewhat reasonable, 65 to 85. That's, a few questions. You have to, it's not a big leap. I mean, it's basically getting you to change your answers on a couple of questions over the course of the therapy, essentially. But in any event, when they published their paper in the Lancet, it turned out that they changed that whole analysis, and it turned out that patients were considered back to normal, as one of the researchers said, or they were within a normal range. They'd met the outcome threshold. It wasn't at that point called recovery, but they could enter the trial at 65 on the physical function scale, score a 60, so get worse. That was considered within normal range. So that was considered having met the outcome threshold. So basically, they could get worse in the trial. And 2 years after the 2011 paper, they published a paper about recovery that was specifically about recovery. So this now became a recovery item. So you could enter the trial as 65 or below. 65, you were disabled, and you could leave the trial at 60 on physical function, having gotten worse, and you would be deemed recovered for physical function. So I have
So
this.
to
I have
clarify, because this is it's confusing because it seems to not make sense because it doesn't make sense,
It's very confusing.
right?
And it's like it's insane. It's literally insane. And I've been
Yeah,
accused by of saying the researchers are insane. I haven't said the researchers are insane, or if I did, I didn't. I shouldn't have. They're not insane. They know what they're doing. It's insane, though, to
yeah,
insist that you can be recovered and disabled simultaneously on a measure. That's insane. It's gaslighting and it's inducing insanity in other people because you're claiming this is good and anybody can see, and its emperor has no clothes. And this
yeah,
stuff is so in the Lancet, it's more complicated. This is why it's complicated because people say, oh, patients were recovered after the trial. Or David Tuller says patients were recovered after the trial, and that's not true. I mean, they were recovered when they entered the trial. I never said they were recovered fully because the problem is they had four different measures for recovery, and you had to be recovered on each of them to be counted as recovered in the trial. I've only said, now, all four of those, including the physical function and fatigue ones, were weakened and during the court, went from what were in the protocol to the end. And that's fraudulent
mm,
because they didn't get, as far as I can tell, they didn't get any ethical permission from their committees or any oversight permission from their committees to completely change the definition of recovery, as they did in that paper. Um, so they've only, so it's that people were recovered at baseline specifically for physical function. So nobody should say they were recovered overall at the trial. No, they were not. Um, but you can't be recovered for any measure at baseline. It's insane. You can't do that. And
yeah. You have to have some improvement to be improved.
yes, you have to have some improvement, and you can't be. And what happened was that in the Lancet paper, it's more confusing because they didn't call it a recovery measure; they called it being within normal range. They did a statistical
Mm,
manipulation and came up with what they called a normal range, which is a statistical terminology, and they did it wrong, and they know that they did it wrong, and that's fraudulent also because they know they did it the wrong way. And how do we know that? Because they did it a different way, or they did it the same way in a previous paper and said, well, this isn't quite the right way to do it. So they know that they did it the wrong way,
yeah.
which gave them this threshold of 60 for physical function, and then they called that being within normal range. And at the press conference, Trudy Chalder, one of the three lead authors, said people got back to normal. And so all the press coverage was about people getting back to normal, which is the same as recovered. And so
Mm,
but that was a misnomer because it was within normal range on a statistical level, which has absolutely nothing to do with normality in terms of your normal health. It's just a statistical measure. So they lied at the press conference. The coverage all around the world was people got back to normal and so on and so forth. And so the whole thing, from my perspective, was a fraudulent display of horrible research misconduct, and nobody's really held them to account except for the fact that their reputations have suffered. But nobody's actually
mm.
the actual. I mean, the journals have not dealt with the horrible mistakes in the papers.
We'll talk about what those, the consequences that maybe should have be the PACE trial should face. But so far, I want to summarize what you've talked about with PACE. One, cognitive behavioral therapy and graded exercise therapy, which were the interventions, were not blinded. Patients who were participating in the studies knew whether they were getting the intervention or not, because it's very hard to fake or give a placebo for physical therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy.
Right.
You are then, I know there's a term for this where that idea is put in your mind that this is going to help you. And from what I understand with cognitive behavioral therapy in particular, it is linked to the success is linked to you believing it's going to work. You're more likely to benefit from cognitive behavioral therapy if you believe cognitive behavioral therapy is going to help you. Is that right?
Yes, that's. Let's not talk about cognitive behavior therapy overall, but in this, because in this
Sure.
particular domain, part of the if you look at the patient manuals and the therapy manuals that were done for like the PACE trial and for other trials, they're basically in general full of uh, things about how this can get you better and how other studies have shown that this can, whatever, and other people have gotten better. And it's sort of inducing in you the
Mm,
hope, if not the belief, the hope that, you will, the idea is that you think that you have an unhelpful belief that you have a perpetual condition that's hard to cure. That's only your unhelpful belief. The core of the
yeah.
belief is that you got an infectious illness or had some other physiological trauma or stress trauma. So you had some trauma, but often a viral illness or an infectious illness. So then you're lying in bed and this is what they say about long COVID as well. You're lying in bed for a month because you're recovering, as can happen. Then you get up and you don't feel good because you're deconditioned. But there's all these people out there saying, "Oh my God, long COVID! Oh my God, you might have ME," and the core feature of ME is post exertional malaise. So you better not do too much because you're going to get worse. So you get terrified by this. So you have this unhelpful belief of having ME or long COVID or PEM or whatever the unhelpful belief being that you can't do activity as you normally did. So what do? You go back to bed, then you get more deconditioned, then you get depressed because you're deconditioned, then your sleep disruption, you get cognitive memory, everything happens, and you're in a so-called vicious cycle or vicious downward cycle that you need to sort of break into at one of two ways, either by cognitively or behaviorally, right? So the cognitive way is sort of try to deal with your unhelpful beliefs and get you to start doing more so that then you have little experiments that show that you can do more if you do it carefully. Or you start from the behavioral side and say, okay, why don't you just do a little more? And then let's talk about how you can do a little more. So you're getting the cognitive side in, but you're approaching it more from the behavioral side. So that's kind of the genesis of why you want to break in one
Mm,
of two ways. But yes, so the cognitive behavior therapy is trying to sort of get you to sort of think differently about your disease so that you recognize that you don't have ongoing perpetuating things. What's perpetuating your disease is your deconditioning and your mental idea that you can't do anything, not any ongoing pathophysiological dysfunctions or not anything going on with brain, vascular, anything. It's nothing like that. It's
mhm.
just once you're over the illness, you're over the illness. It's
You
just
should you should be
deconditioning.
better because your mind and is not that. So this we're to clarify, this is the thought process of CBT proponents for
Yes,
diseases like ME/CFS and long COVID,
this is the
that your problem is not that you have a physiological disorder. At some point, your problem is now that you believe you have a physiological disorder, and that belief is limiting your activity and then worsening whatever physical symptoms you have.
yes, and you have
And we all know, yeah, we all know there is a big toll psychologically that having a chronic illness, especially one that suddenly hits you, is going to impact in your life. But there is nuance there that studies like PACE don't seem, at least from my view, don't seem to appreciate. So there was a problem with the blinding and the intervention. And then there was also, you said, a problem with changing the criteria of success. And
yes,
that is something that when you're doing a research study, for those who aren't familiar with how these research studies go, you have to be very clear as a researcher when you're submitting your project to your IRB. Um, that these are the criteria for entry, meaning these are the type of patients we're going to have. This is the clear intervention we're going to do. And this is the criteria that we're going to use to determine whether the intervention was successful or not. And it is not common, as you were saying. And I think what you're arguing, it's not really ethical to go in the middle of the project and change the criteria of success, especially in the way that it was done in PACE, where people who were initially considered ill at their same level can now be considered recovered.
For specific, on specific measures, yes.
Yeah. And
One
then the data is a little manipulated that way.
The problem
Go
isn't,
ahead.
and to clarify, the problem isn't just that the studies are unblinded. That's understandable. The problem is
Mm-hmm.
that you're combining that solely with subjective findings of how people feel, which you wouldn't do in a drug trial, and you're not
Yes.
acknowledging. So when in PACE they had several objective measures. The objective measures all had either null, like no find, there were no benefits, or the benefits in one case were clinically insignificant. In other words, they were marginally better, but it didn't mean anything from the clinical perspective of how the patient felt. And so basically, they failed on the objective measures they chose, which were how far people could walk in 6 minutes. It's a 6 minute walking test. It's a standard test. A standard fitness test, which is like on a step stool, stepping up and down, and then
Mm-hmm.
how the people got on, whether people were more likely to be off benefits afterwards, or whether people were more likely to be employed. Or have more employment hours, and on all of those measures, they failed. I mean, there were, again, they didn't get any significant findings, clinically significant findings, and in most cases, no statistically significant findings. And so they ignored those findings essentially and said they didn't really matter. And all these studies, including the other studies, either don't have any objective findings, or if they have some objective findings, they show nothing, and then they downplay them, and they pretend that they pretend they mention them in the fine print, but they don't actually highlight them. So basically, you have a lot of studies. The whole research base has been found by NICE in England when it released its latest guidelines in 2021 for MECFS, that the entire research base for CBT and GET were the quality of the evidence was either poor or very poor, including the PACE trial. So, the most recent, or the latest, I don't know if it's the most recent, but a very recent authoritative look at all these studies, from a government agent, or quasi-government, NICE is quasi-independent, from an authoritative agency the UK, is that this stuff is shit, and that there's really no evidentiary value in these recommendations for MECFS.
So you said a lot. You said a lot there that the subjective findings were fishy in the PACE trial, and the objective measures were essentially did not show an improvement,
Right.
and were also swept under the rug a little bit.
Metaphor, yes, they were. I would say they were. They would probably deny that, but I would say yes, I can say that.
But they were minimized. And
Minimized.
you mentioned the nice, yeah, you mentioned the nice guidelines. So this study is a really big deal, and I think patients with long COVID need to understand the impact of it, because I'm seeing so many similarities now in long COVID research.
Mm-hmm.
But to clarify, the NICE guidelines, NICE is an acronym for something I don't know off the top of my head, but
The
it does sort of
sorry, the
it
national.
sets sort of the, sorry, go ahead.
All right, sorry. There's a little bit of a delay, so it seems like we're interrupting each other.
Yes.
We're not meaning to. It's the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. It was something else before, and then they changed the name, but they kept, I think, but they kept the acronym. So it's a weird acronym, but that's what it's called. And in the UK, everybody knows what NICE is, and their guidelines are very influential. They're only technically, they're advisory, they're technically advisory only for England and Wales, but they're also
Mhm.
widely observed elsewhere in the UK, and they're respected and cited in other countries, and so they're considered quite authoritative. Whether I can't speak for them, but that's their who they are. The one other thing I wanted to say that I
Yeah.
thought was very important about the PACE trial is that. Um, the three main authors were all at various points, and I perhaps still, and I don't know still, but we're all at various points consultants to disability insurance companies or health insurers and disability insurers, as well as government agencies in the UK. And so the PACE trial was partly funded by the Department for Work and Pension, which obviously had an interest in not paying as much money for people on disability, and insurance companies obviously have a lot of interest in not paying as much for health care and disability for people with uh, complicated illnesses that can seemingly go on for years. So they would much rather hear a message from people like the lead PACE investigators that cognitive behavior therapy and graded exercise therapy are very beneficial. So when they wrote their protocol for the PACE trial, they promised to adhere to the Declaration of Helsinki, which is a human rights document which requires researchers at this time, required researchers to disclose any possible conflicts of interests to their human subjects. Needless to say, in PACE, these obvious conflicts of interest that these investigators were have close affiliations with disability insurance companies were not disclosed to patients, nor to participants in the trial. Now, when they were published in 2011 and later, all the papers did disclose these affiliations, but they didn't disclose them to patients. And so basically, they have no ethical permission, from my perspective, or no legitimate ethical permission to have conducted the trial in the first place. Now, when I raised this with the authors in my initial investigation, their response is ridiculous. They say, well, we disclosed it in the journals. And I'm like, yeah, but the Declaration of Helsinki was not written to protect journal editors. Or journal readers. It was written to protect the people you're subjecting to your experimentation, and you promise to adhere to it, and you can't just not do things that you don't like once you actually get the money and the ethical permission to do the study. But they just dropped that. I don't even think they knew if it was in there. They just probably put that in as a matter of course. But anyway, they did not follow their own protocol, and nobody has held them to account for this. It is shocking behavior on the part of the Lancet, on the part of everybody in the UK medical establishment. It is just shocking, extremely disturbing. It's emperor has no clothesism at the highest level. It's very disturbing.
So tell me about more about that. The NICE guidelines initially after the PACE study was published supported the use of CBT and GET based on what PACE found. The
Not
most recent guidelines have don't
right.
support the use as treatment, but rather as support. Is that
Yes,
right?
not quite. The first guidelines came out in 2007, so that was while PACE was being done, but before PACE had any reports. Now, it has to be said that the genesis of the guidelines and the genesis of the PACE trial were essentially the same group of people. So the
Mm.
guidelines in 2007 were just based on the opinion of these people who also, got the PACE trial approved, and they stacked the committee with people who believed that, and because they were considered the authorities. And so they basically recommended these treatments based on very flimsy evidence that had been done in much smaller studies. And again, the studies all had the same problems that I said. They're all subjective outcomes, based on open label studies and unblinded studies. So that it wasn't worth much. But so the 2007 guideline purported to be based on evidence, but it was really based on just the opinions of the people who were also at the time the same part of the same larger group of people doing the PACE trial. So it wasn't necessarily the PACE trial people on the committee, but it was part of the same group overall that believed this idea about what chronic fatigue syndrome, which was what it was then being called, or chronic fatigue syndrome slash ME. So then the PACE trial came out in 2011, and there was a lot of hullabaloo about how it supported the PACE. The PACE trial now is reported, and it supports the outcome of the guidelines. And so, NICE guidelines are supposed to be reviewed in 10 years, whether they need to be updated. So in 2017, there was a review by NICE, whether these needed to be reviewed. So, of course, they asked a handful, so they do that by asking independent experts. But the independent experts they asked were essentially all the same people that had been involved, from what one can tell, because I filed a Freedom of Information request. So first they announced they were not going to, that the old guidelines were fine. Their independent committee said, great, the old guidelines are fine. Nothing new here. When, you know, that wasn't quite true. There had been since then not only my reporting, but the Institute of Medicine report. There had been a lot of pushback against this kind of ideology. I mean, I think it's a cult ideology at this point that sort of believes this because there's no scientific basis for it. So what happened was there was a big uproar in among the community and some of the doctors who were involved, and I got the documentation of their consultation, their really minimalist consultation with, I think it was 7, I can't remember, it was a very small number of experts, and you could tell that they were all just experts who were, I couldn't quite put the names on them, but I might have been able to just by the way they phrased themselves. So basically, it was just an in-house kind of like, let's dismiss this, let's ask the same people. And so they got a lot of pushback on that. And then after there was and then they asked for open, I guess it was also open comment on their decision not to, and they got such pushback that they then opened it up. And then they went through a couple of years of developing an excruciatingly balanced committee of of what they thought were pro and con people, like patient, of clinicians who had been on one side. And anyway, they had a 21-person committee. It had 5, I think, patient representatives, patients or patient representatives. So the idea that it was dominated by clinicians of various kinds and other experts, and they reviewed the evidence and they came up with the guidelines they came up with, which basically said that all the evidence previously used was essentially nonsense. If I can say nonsense for evidence that's considered poor or very poor. And that there was no evidence to recommend graded exercise therapy. And in fact, patient reports and other data suggest that it could be very harmful. And so they recommend against graded exercise therapy. They recommend, they don't recommend, but the guidelines say that cognitive behavior therapy should not be offered on the basis of unhelpful beliefs, but it might be offered as supportive care, in the sense of what you mentioned, that people have, of course, distress about having a chronic illness. They have distress about having an illness nobody believes they can have. Just the distress of trying to navigate life with complications. Those are all reasons one might want to have psychological supportive care. But it's not that it shouldn't be offered as a reason for curing anybody of their illness. And so those were the basic conclusions, which of course got a lot of pushback from the usual suspects. And there's been back and forth in the literature since then, but I think they're pretty solid, and they were based on pretty fair review of the data. And so that's where things are. One of the issues why it was so contentious was that everybody knew they started this before COVID happened, because this process started in 2017. But once the pandemic happened, it was very clear from the very, very beginning, one, that long COVID, that there was going to be a thing, that there was going to, we didn't know it was going to be called long COVID, but that there was going to be a thing, a wave of people with illness, non-specific symptoms, relapses, profound fatigue, post-exertional malaise, cognitive things. That was clear that was going to happen. It was also clear that these people were going to be told that they probably had psychological issues or had anxiety, and that they were going to be told to exercise. And so NICE knew this from the beginning. And it was very clear that the battle over these guidelines were in effect somewhat of a proxy battle over what are we going to do about long COVID. And so I think that's why, to some degree, I mean, I think there's legitimate reasons for passions to be high, even if it was just about ME, or what we're calling MECFS. But I think the fact that it really was a proxy fight over long COVID, and everybody knew that long COVID and the MECFS have overlaps and parallels. If some cases of long COVID seem to be ME, we don't really know exactly what the overlaps are, but there are overlaps. So NICE put out there were a lot of delays, a couple of delays in putting out the nice guidelines. During the delays, because of the pandemic, and then because of a lot of they got more public comment than they thought, and so on. But during the delays, at one point they put out a statement saying that uh, basically indicating nice that they knew that that the old guidelines should not be cited, which did allow for get should not be cited to suggest that people with long COVID should be told to exercise. It shouldn't automatically be applied to people with prolonged symptoms after COVID. And they only did that because they knew that it was being cited, that the NICE guidelines were being cited early on for MECFS, were being for CF the 2007 guidelines were being cited for long COVID patients, and they didn't want that to happen. So that was an indication that they were going to get rid of get for in the MECFS guidelines, that they were telling people we don't recommend, we're not saying don't use the old guidelines to recommend get for long COVID patients. Anyway, that's what happened with the 2021 guidelines, and you know now they're out there, and those who have opposed it are sort of like little throwing tantrums and stamping their feet and saying no, 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 but this was the document.
Yeah, so thank you for that explanation. We're Tell me more about how you see this same sort of problems with research studies and this discussion of CBT and sort of a biopsychosocial model of disease now that we're facing long COVID.
Well, it's interesting. So when long COVID happened, and you knew this there would be a wave of this and this, and I just couldn't believe you see people around millions around the world reporting similar things. Either there's global mass hysteria, or people are really sick. I think I know which I think I will believe, and the same people who I had already felt like I had, tried to discredit their work, and successfully to some degree, with ME. We're doing the same. We're coming around saying the exact same things about long COVID. It's like nothing ever happened. And at one point I was thinking I was sort of going to end my project because I thought, well, I've done what I can do, and nice guidelines have come out. And then I thought, well, it's kind of interesting. The same people are doing the same thing, and now they're doing it on a global basis with the potential to impact many more people negatively. And so, it just was like, and they're still citing the PACE trial, and they're still claiming the PACE trial is good. And there's people, I don't get it, So, um, you have seen the same people doing some making first in the first year or two, before there were any studies about long COVID. Really, well, there were surveys, but there weren't any trials and so on. Oh, and we were just learning more. But there were the first patient surveys and so on. Um,
Mhm.
they were just citing the MECFS studies or the PACE study to sort of make their point. Um, when the trial started, the protocol started coming in, you could see they're doing the exact same thing. So there's two big trials that have come out. I'm sure there's more that I've written about, but there was one recently where they claimed that a psychological, and this was done at the University of Warwick in England, and they claimed that a mental health and physical rehab program was clinically effective for patients with I don't want to long COVID or post COVID-19 or whatever they were calling their
Mhm.
cluster, um, and then it turns out that the it turns out not to be true, because it turns out that for their main measure, which was a measure of what they called again, this was an open label study, unblinded, with just how do you feel kinds of questions. So uh, it should have been a slam dunk. It's hard to get bad results for something like that. But they every scale, or not every, but many questionnaires have what they call a minimally clinically minimally important difference, or clinically a, a, a minimal clinical significance or minimally important difference, which means if it moves this much, it may be statistically significant, but who cares because you're not going to feel a difference. It's
Mhm.
clinically insignificant. So however they do it, they come up with this change on this scale is what we're going to consider clinically significant. Well, it turns out that for the main measure on this trial, which was just published last month, um, the improvement was below the level considered clinically significant for that measure. And yet, in the abstract, they called it clinically significant. Later in the discussion, they say, oh, by the way, it actually turns out that there has been some change in what's considered clinically significant. And in fact, our measure was below. So basically, they admit in the discussion that they lied in the abstract and that they lied in the earlier part in the method section when they said what was the level of this level of clinical significance. So basically, it's ridiculous. It's just, you know,
It's so
this was also,
frustrating for
sorry, this was also widely publicized. So this was in the BMJ. So this is
yeah.
along with the Lancet, like the major medical journal in the UK, published this garbage. I mean, I would say the study's garbage, but you can't claim something's clinically effective if it hasn't met the standard that you're citing for being clinically significant. You just can't. But they did. So, this was pointed out elsewhere, not just but I sort of saw it and put together a group of others, and we wrote a letter to the BMJ asking for correction. The BMJ wrote back just last week and said, "Can you please submit a rapid response?" So I sent a letter back yesterday saying, "No, we're not going to submit a rapid response. There's already a rapid response that makes this point. Do your job. Correct the paper. This is not open for debate. It's just wrong. You can't just not correct something that's wrong and that has impacted public health policy. It's crazy. Sorry, I
Can
did very.
you explain what a rapid response is?
Oh, sorry. Okay. So some journals, when a paper is published, there's different ways to comment on it. You can send a formal letter for correspondence, and that you have to submit that through this editorial portal. And like in one case, it might get peer reviewed, or maybe it's just the editors look at it, and then it's formally published and it's cited in PubMed, and people can search for it and find it in the literature. That's okay. At least you can make your comment known to everybody, or at least it's cited. You can find it if you look for it. A rapid response is just like commenting on somebody's blog. You just comment. Anybody can comment. I think it goes through a cursory review to make sure it's not, whatever. But basically, anybody can post a rapid response, but it doesn't. People don't see it. It's not in the medical literature. It's
Mm.
just kind of like a way of allowing somebody to let off steam and not having to do anything. So, to me, I'm sort of irritated by the idea of we point out a mistake and you ask us to send something else that nobody's going to see to tell you that there's a mistake. No, that's not how it works. We point out a mistake, you have to fix it. It's not our job to send in another
Mhm.
letter so that you might then decide to discuss it. No, fix the fucking
Mm.
paper. Sorry.
Mhm. No, that's so interesting and also so frustrating because my ultimate question then is like a lot of people are having, how do we trust press releases? How should we interpret medical journalism? The world of public health has been shaken by COVID, the pandemic, the mismanagement of messaging, and the world of journalism is under a lot of pressure right now. We've been here in the States, hearing about tons of cuts to news departments. There's not a lot of people like you who have a background in both journalism and science and can critically review these research studies. How does someone who's sick, who's learning about long COVID, or a family member of that person, what should they be looking for when they're reading things on this topic?
That's a very hard question. And so, for me, obviously, I have my own, I understand something about epidemiology, but I know nothing about medicine, or biology,
Mm,
something, but very little. So people might ask me, like, what about this study about some medical thing? And I have no idea. And I have no idea how I would make my way through that except by finding the experts that I trust. So I think basically everybody needs to find experts that they trust. And, I mean, it's really complicated because obviously experts are disagreeing all over the place, and it I don't really have a good answer for that. Um, I just myself rely on some common sense, that, like, for example, with the PACE study, I you look at it and you think, well, it can't possibly be that people can be recovered on a measure at baseline. And then you look at the paper, the recovery plan, and you say, oh my God, it is. And so to some degree, there's common sense. Like, people who are going to do that in a study don't trust anything they say. People who you find in one study make things up or lie or don't disclose conflicts, don't believe what they say. Now, I need to say that the only reason I can afford to do this is that patients essentially send donations to Berkeley. I crowdfund twice a year. Berkeley has a crowdfunding platform, so I don't take any money personally. Berkeley has a crowdfunding platform. The money goes to Berkeley. It goes to my department at the School of Public Health. They take the money and they pay me my salary and pay my benefits. That's how I can keep doing it. That's kind of insane. Why should patients have to be paying for basic oversight work? And the other thing is that I did this for a couple of years on my own. I spent a year investigating the PACE
mm,
trial. I went to England and spent a month there, talking to people. That was my own time and money and whatever. I mean, I had a job, so it was fine. I could do it. I didn't. I'm not complaining that I did that, but that was the only way I could write a big piece about the PACE trial, and my piece had impact. But you can't expect people to spend years of their lives. I mean, it is terrible. I don't understand. You when I was learning as a journalist, not that I was trained, but when I was learning, you sort of think, oh, something's in the BMJ, something's in the Lancet, you can trust it. My dad was a doctor. We had lancets all around the house. I mean, I wouldn't have grown up thinking, gee, I can't trust something that's been vetted by the Lancet. But I don't trust anything much anymore in these journals that I've already seen, at least in this domain, are willing to publish what's essentially garbage and not correct it.
mm,
And, it's shocking to me as a former newspaper reporter. You hate when you make mistakes. You hate it, but you correct them, even if you notice it, or even if your mother noticed it and told you, and she's not going to tell anybody. You correct your mistakes. You take responsibility.
mm.
That these people are not. I don't understand it. It leaves me. I'm flabbergasted. So I don't.
So
That's
tell us a little more how you publish your work now. You've worked for, what I think people call legacy media. You've worked for San Francisco Chronicle, you've been a writer for New York Times, you worked for Salon. How do you publish your pieces now?
mainly I do three things. I blog on Virology blog. Sometimes I'm able to spin those off into articles. I can't write, into articles for news organizations. Like, I wrote a long piece last year about a young woman in England who died of ME-related complications. So that was, I like, and that was not, I mean, that was for like a news organization. So sometimes I do that. So that's one set. Um, I write peer-reviewed commentaries or things. I engage in the peer-reviewed literature by doing the things like working commentaries or writing obnoxious letters to journal editors, asking them to correct things or retract things. I do that a lot, and that sometimes has an effect, but other times it just sort of makes noise and gets people angry at me. And then I blog, I do some journalism stuff, and then I do, you know, peer reviewed things. So I try to kind of balance them all. So I'm having a impact in all. And I also do a lot of stuff that, I do this, I talk to other journalists who are writing stories. So I feed them material or I give them suggestions. So I do stuff that doesn't get seen, but, it's sort of part of my overall thing. So I don't deal much with long COVID now. There's been so much about ME written, and so I used to feel like if I didn't write something about ME, like in the New York Times when I was doing that about it probably would have been ignored, a lot of it, So I was able to get stuff in media. Now it seems less important because there are people interested in it because ME has become. I mean, 10 years ago, I was sort of working in plowing this tiny little field in some corner that nobody was paying attention to. Once long COVID happened, all that previous work turns out to have had some actual value beyond the small domain that it seemed to be
Absolutely.
targeted for. So I think it laid the groundwork for people being able to start off with long COVID being more skeptical of some of these claims. Um, but I felt less that it's incumbent upon me. I feel like I can do things that I'm doing, and it's less incumbent upon me to, or maybe I have less interest, or maybe it's younger people writing. I don't know what it is. I'm just not as focused on getting stuff in the mainstream media, although I try to when I can, and I should be more. But um, so
Sure.
that's
Well, I think a lot of us are, looking for more independent journalists to follow. So
oh,
we're definitely going to leave Virology blog and your contacts in the show notes too.
I
But
want to
you were
give
going to say something.
a related to virology blog, which virology blog I kind of hijack it, and it was it's really my friend and colleague Vincent Racaniello's blog. He's a microbiology uh, uh, professor at Columbia, and so I started. I posted my long pace investigation there, and then I kept writing. So at some point, he allowed me just to basically hijack it for my project. He still posts, but he does more of his things on This Week in Virology, which is his video cast. So that's a great resource.
Hmm.
I think during the pandemic, especially, it became incredibly valuable and popular, as did Virology blog became more popular. So in a way, my work benefited from the resurgence of interest in virology during the pandemic. Um, so I think. Ed Young at the Atlantic obviously brought huge attention to long COVID. That was incredibly valuable. Um, and it last just a couple of weeks ago, columnist in the Guardian in the UK, well-known columnist, published a very passionate article about how horrible treatment's been for ME patients, ME/CFS, over the decades, and called out some of the people that I've been challenging for years. So that was fantastic. So I think things have changed a little bit. You broke up a little bit there for me. I don't know if I broke up for you.
You did, but you're back.
Okay. So I don't know if the breaking up is happening on my side or your side, but maybe it's on my side.
It might be both of ours, but I think all of the information
Okay.
will still be there, even if we didn't see
So
it.
I think there's a huge change now than what there was when I was first doing this. At that point,
Yeah.
really, I could hear. I couldn't even. If you suggest to editors over the phone, I'd like to say that you suggest to editors that you might chronic fatigue syndrome. You could hear their eyes rolling in their head as soon as they heard, "Oh, there's Tuller again. There he is on that chronic fatigue syndrome thing." But anyway, it's a bit different now, and I think there are more people, and there's more people who know somebody who's sick. And I think the people that I think NICE guidelines really helped expose these people and their research for the crap that it is. And I'm glad.
Hmm.
I think it's still we're in a
That's
paradigm shift
great.
of how post acute infectious illnesses are being seen. So we're sort of in a paradigm shift of them being seen as largely psychosomatic or biopsychosocial to being viewed as there's something going on with people that we need to figure out pathophysiologically and then figure out how to treat them. That shift is
Yes,
happening.
I agree.
It's too
Yeah,
slow.
I'm hoping that it is too slow, but I'm hoping that this is some motivation to, even if long COVID isn't exactly MECFS, and more likely, I think there are clearly phenotypes of patients who have both of these disorders. And I hope some, resources are allocated very clearly so that we can get the most bang for the buck and get some answers for both of the conditions
Yeah, one thing I want to say about long COVID, and I think it's good to be clear that long COVID is very, very a generic, non-specific term. So it's not right to equate long COVID and ME, even if we're talking about it.
Hmm.
Some people with long COVID have the cluster of symptoms that characterize MECFS, or that are part of the case definitions of ME and MECFS that people are generally using for those, what we're calling those conditions. So many people with long COVID have other symptoms that are not related to that, or some of them, if they were hospitalized, they have conditions related to being hospitalized. They have post ICU syndrome, as they like to call it. They may have, organic complications that, I mean, many, we don't know what organic complications everybody's having, but they may have frank, visible organic complications that are known, but they still may be lumped into a long COVID category depending upon how it's being defined. So, what we're talking about with long COVID is that there's a significant cluster of unknown size in the long COVID category that are parallel in many ways to ME/CFS patients.
Thank you for that clarification. I co-sign everything you said. I think in particular, it's important to, even if we're not relating the two and the two disease processes don't have overlaps physiologically or they don't match, there is this Venn diagram that overlaps in the approach that the scientific community has to the disorder. And that's what I wanted to share on this episode today. And your work has been so important in contextualizing why certain research is being done on long COVID, why there is a pretty significant push to treat this disorder as one that is almost, you know, certainly psychologically based. And I think we do better as patients with long COVID when we understand the history of poorly understood diseases like ME/CFS.
I think that, again, I am always very humble and aware that I don't speak as a patient. I speak as just, and I don't speak as a clinician, and I don't speak as a medical person. I only speak as a person who looks at research and thinks, I mean, as someone in public health and a journalist, that the research that I look at is pretty awful. So I can't tell
Mhm.
people what it is. I can't tell people what's causing these symptoms. That's not my domain. Um, and nor do I try. I just try to look at studies and what people are saying and say, are they presenting any evidence to back this up or not? So that's,
Well, your work is very important in that realm. Very, very important. This isn't going to be a one specialty solution. This is a multifaceted disease that needs a multifaceted approach, and we need people who are vigilant on the research and able to communicate what they find with the rest of us. So, thank you so much.
thank you. I appreciate that. Right.
What are you working on in the future? Do you have any new projects or ongoing projects?
You mean related to this project or just other?
Anything. Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. I'm not much of a planner. I keep wondering, I mean, I do. Uh, uh, well, I mean, I'm going to keep doing this at least for the next year or so. Um, I have
Great.
I crowdfund twice a year, so I decided I would crowdfund two more times this year, and then that would take me to the end of the academic year of to June 2025, and then I can figure out if I've done enough, and maybe time to, I don't know, figure something else out or pull it all together in a book or something or not. I don't know. I'm not very
That would be great.
forward thinking. So
There's
those
a
are.
lot of options though. So tell us about your crowdsourcing because your crowdfunding.
So
A lot of people with academic positions apply for grants that support their position. The grant money goes, I don't know if a lot of people know this, but the grant money goes to the university and then the
Right.
university distributes it to the researcher or the research lab. that can get a little complicated because you're getting money from sometimes organizations that then you feel that you are obligated to sort of serve. You have an alternative approach at UC Berkeley where your academic position is funded by the public. Can you tell
Well,
us more about that and how we can help?
yes, it's very bizarre. Um, so when I started this, I had a position. I was running a joint master's program in public health and journalism, and that's what I was getting paid to do. And so this was a side project. Just I was doing it because it was interesting to me, and so I did that. And then I had funding for my position. Most people at the University of California are funded by outside, not state funding. They're funded from outside grants, and like you say, every grant comes with its you know no funder is completely without requests. So anyway, um,
Mm-hmm.
so I was doing this, and then the funding for what I was doing, was after 7 or 8 years, and that funding ran out, and so I had a position, but I didn't have any money to fill it, and so I was talking to the dean of public health at the time, and I said, Steph, what am I going to do? He said, well, you have this other project, and if you crowdfund for the project and on Berkeley's platform, and the money comes to Berkeley, we can keep paying you. And I'm like, I can crowdfund my academic position. He's like, David, you have an academic position, so just bring us money. We don't care. So I was like, okay. Okay. I started crowd. Berkeley has a thing, so I did a campaign, and sure enough, I got enough money to fund me for the next year. And so basically that was started in 2018, I think, maybe 27 to 2018. I can't remember. I think it was anyway. I think I'm not sure. Anyway, 6 years ago. So since the pandemic, I basically do it twice a year, and I basically the crowdfunding site. People, it's like I see I'm breaking up again, or you're breaking up. So I'll wait for a second until you're back. Okay, there you are. The crowdfunding site is a couple of thousand for this, soup kitchen, or for this campus project, or for uniforms for the baseball team, or for the math club or something. And then every semester, I raise about $65,000 to cover my salary and benefits at two-thirds time. I'm a two-thirds employee for the next semester. So I've done that for about 7 years, and I've raised about, I think, close to $900,000 in crowdfunding. So again, it doesn't come to me. It goes directly to the university. They take 5%, is it maybe 7.5% now, 5% gift fee. And the rest goes to my department, and they pay me I have a salary and benefits as regulated by the University of California that are standard. So I raise money enough to cover my salary two-thirds. So as far as I know, I'm the only academic person with an academic position that's crowdfunded. Now, it should be said, this wasn't my idea initially, and I didn't set out to do this, but it's worked. It wouldn't have occurred to me to do, because I don't like asking patients for money. On the other hand, it's how I can afford to do what I'm doing. And of course, I'm accused of having conflicts of interest. And of course, there are conflicts of interest in I always mention them, mention that, in anything I write, it has a disclosure that my position is funded by patients. I don't think it, I think I'm accused of saying things I wouldn't say. I point out that I was happy to trash the PACE trial for free for at least a couple of years at great length and publicly without getting paid by anybody at all. So I think that established my bona fides that I'm doing this legitimately because I believe it and not because I'm getting paid by patients. But, of course, the PACE authors have links to insurance companies, and I have links to patients. I'm not ashamed of that.
Yep.
It is what it is.
Well, I think it is an unusual setup, but ME, CFS, and long COVID are unusual diseases that have required a lot of patient advocacy. And
Mm-hmm.
I know there's plenty of people who want to support journalists doing work for our benefit. It doesn't necessarily mean you're serving us, but like I said, you're being vigilant on research that impacts us. And I think that's worthy of supporting. So we're going to put your links to your crowdfunding in the show notes as well.
Because
Where can our listeners find you? Where do
well,
you want to be found?
I'm happy to be found. I'm very easy to be found. I'm on Facebook. I'm David Tuller 1 on X. I'm not that happy about being on X, but it is a good way
I
to
don't
send.
think anybody is.
My email at Berkeley is DAVETULLER at berkeley.edu. And Berkeley is BERKELEY. So people often skip one or two of the E's. And my crowdfunding will be in May. I usually do it in April, but this year I'm going to do it in May. So I'm going to do it in May and November this year. And that probably, it may be the last time. I don't know. I'm not going to permanently, but I'm doing at least that. And um, then we'll see.
Well, thank you so much for spending this time with us. We really appreciate it. Thank you for talking to me, and it's so nice to meet you. I hope we get to connect again.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And I'm sorry. I can go on and on. I can get very agitated because I just sort of find it hard to believe. And sometimes my explanations, I think, can get, in the weeds. So I appreciate that you.
You have nothing to apologize for. This was great.
Thank you. Bye.
So that was the famous and infamous David Tuller. He has a lot more to talk about. He is, like I said, a wealth of information. And hopefully, we'll talk to him again about some of the latest research articles, including the Regain study that has hit the presses recently and also garnered some criticism. Consider following David, consider contributing and supporting him. For me, consider following me on Twitter or X at Dr_Zeist. Rate and follow this podcast. Tell your friends, tell your patients, tell your colleagues, tell your acupuncturist, and let's try our best to build this up. The best thing to do is word of mouth spread. So I'd appreciate you helping me out with that. I would love to hear from you. My email, as always, is longcovidmd@gmail.com. I check that account regularly and I always write back. Tell me your story with long COVID. Are you struggling and suffering from it? How did you get your diagnosis? What do you think about how to read news articles or studies on long COVID? Are they making you super confused? Do you feel like you can trust anything? Let me know. Also, let me know if you're a caretaker of somebody with long COVID and are trying to do the same thing. I think we'll be able to sort all of this out together. So that was our episode for today. Please continue to follow. Look forward to more episodes. And until next time, bye for now.